The death of Margaret Delacroix, the wealthy widow known for her philanthropy and social influence, came as a shock to everyone in town. Her sudden passing raised many questions, and whispers of foul play began to spread like wildfire. People who had known her closely couldn't believe that her end had been so sudden and inexplicable. She had always been the epitome of strength and resilience, yet now she was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. Detective Michael Harrison was assigned to the case. He had been known for his meticulous nature and his ability to piece together even the most complex puzzles. From the moment he stepped into the grandiose mansion of Margaret, he could feel that something was off. The house was too silent, the atmosphere too heavy. The grand halls that had once been full of life now seemed hollow, and the air itself was suffused with an aura of secrecy. Harrison began his investigation by interviewing those closest to Margaret. First was James, her loyal butler, who had served her for more than 20 years. James looked visibly shaken and barely managed to speak coherently. "Madam had her enemies," he said, his hands trembling slightly. "But she never spoke about them openly. She preferred to keep her troubles to herself." His words only fueled Harrison's suspicion that there was more to this story. Harrison then spoke to Evelyn, Margaret's closest friend. Evelyn was a sophisticated woman, known for her sharp wit and charm. She seemed distraught but guarded, as though there was something she wasn't telling. "Margaret had been anxious for weeks," Evelyn admitted. "She mentioned something about threats, but never went into detail. I think she was afraid, but she wouldn't let it show. She was too proud for that." Evelyn's words hinted at something much darker lurking beneath the surface of Margaret's life. One name kept coming up during his initial inquiries: Clarissa. She was known as Henry Delacroix's former lover, a shadow from the past who had seemingly reappeared in Margaret's life shortly before her death. It was rumored that Clarissa had once loved Henry deeply, and the love had ended tragically when Henry chose Margaret over her. Many believed that Clarissa had never forgiven either of them, and her reappearance could not be a coincidence. Clarissa lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. When Harrison arrived, she was reluctant to speak to him. Her eyes were weary, and her demeanor was guarded, as though she had been expecting such a visit. "I know why you're here," she said before Harrison could even ask a question. "You want to know about Margaret and Henry?" She sighed deeply. "I loved Henry, and losing him was the hardest thing I've ever endured. But I did not kill Margaret." Her voice was filled with both pain and resentment. Clarissa explained that she had met Margaret recently. "She reached out to me," Clarissa said, her eyes staring into the distance. "She wanted to make peace, I think. She offered me money, told me to leave town and never return, but I didn't want her money." She paused, her voice trembling. "I wanted her to understand what it felt like to lose everything, but I never wanted her dead." Her words seemed genuine, but Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. After speaking to Clarissa, Harrison was left with even more questions. Why had Margaret tried to pay off Clarissa? Was she truly afraid of her, or was there something else driving her actions? The more Harrison delved into Margaret's life, the clearer it became that she had been living under immense pressure. The seemingly perfect life of a wealthy widow was nothing but a fragile facade, ready to crumble at any moment. Harrison decided to look into Margaret's business dealings. Margaret had inherited her late husband Henry's company, Delacroix Investments, and she had always maintained a tight grip on its affairs, but after Henry's death, control had gradually slipped through her fingers, especially with people like Richard Carter on the board. Richard was known for his ambitions, and he had made no secret of his dissatisfaction with Margaret's leadership. Harrison arranged a meeting with Richard Carter. Richard was a charismatic man, always impeccably dressed and well-spoken. He greeted Harrison with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Detective, I assure you, my interests have always been the company's prosperity," he said smoothly. Harrison noticed the slight tension in his voice. "Margaret was, not fit to lead after Henry's passing. She struggled to keep up with the complexities of the business, but that doesn't mean I had anything to do with her death." Harrison could sense that Richard was hiding something. His demeanor, the way he spoke of Margaret, it all felt rehearsed. He decided to dig deeper into Richard's connections. During his investigation, Harrison discovered correspondence between Richard and another individual, a financial advisor named Thomas Wilkins, who seemed to have played a significant role in managing Margaret's affairs in the months leading up to her death. Harrison visited Thomas at his office. Unlike Richard, Thomas seemed visibly uneasy when confronted by the detective. "I only did what I was instructed to do," he stammered. "Mr. Carter asked me to facilitate some transactions. I didn't ask questions, it was all above board, or so I thought." Harrison pressed further, and it became evident that Thomas had been involved in a scheme to pressure Margaret into signing away significant portions of her shares. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly started coming together, Harrison realized that Margaret had been under siege. The people she trusted, the people closest to her, had turned against her. She had been isolated, pressured, and threatened until she finally caved in. But who had ultimately gone so far as to end her life? Was it a crime of passion, or was it part of a much larger plan to seize control of her wealth? The investigation took a new turn when Harrison found a hidden compartment in Margaret's study. Inside was a collection of letters that spoke of fear, of threats that had grown more severe over time. One letter in particular caught Harrison's attention. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. Give up what you cannot keep, or you will lose everything. It was a direct threat, one that Margaret had clearly taken seriously. Harrison took the letters to his superior, presenting them as evidence that Margaret's death was more than just a tragic accident. Someone was after her, Harrison said firmly. She was under constant threat, and it finally broke her. We need to find out who was behind this. His superior agreed, and the investigation was officially upgraded to a homicide case. Harrison returned to Margaret's mansion to conduct another thorough search. This time, he noticed something he had overlooked before, a photograph in Margaret's bedroom. It was a picture of her and Henry, taken many years ago, but there was someone else in the background, a man whose face seemed familiar. Harrison realized it was Lawrence Delacroix, Henry's estranged brother, someone no one had mentioned during the investigation. Lawrence had left town years ago, severing ties with his brother and his family. No one had heard from him since, and it seemed he had been erased from the family's history. Harrison knew he needed to track Lawrence down and find out why he had suddenly reappeared in Margaret's life. Was he another piece of the puzzle, or was he the missing key that could unlock the entire mystery? After weeks of searching, Harrison finally located Lawrence in his small coastal town. Lawrence was a reclusive man, his eyes betraying years of bitterness and regret. When Harrison questioned him about Margaret, Lawrence's expression darkened. "I never wanted anything to do with my brother's affairs," he said. "But Margaret reached out to me. She wanted to make amends, to bring closure to old wounds. I didn't trust her intentions, and I told her to stay away." Harrison left Lawrence with more questions than answers. Margaret had tried to make peace with so many people in her life before her death. Clarissa, Richard, Lawrence. It was as if she knew her time was running out and was trying to settle her affairs, but instead of bringing peace, it seemed to have brought her more enemies. Harrison knew he was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The next day, Harrison began his search for Clarissa again. Despite their previous conversation, he had a feeling there was still more she could tell him. This time, he managed to find her at a different location, where she had been staying temporarily. When she opened the door, her face was a mix of exhaustion and fear. "Detective, I told you everything I knew," she said, but Harrison sensed hesitation. "Clarissa, if you want to protect yourself, you need to tell me the whole truth," Harrison insisted. She sighed deeply, her gaze falling to the floor. "There were things I didn't say. Not because I wanted to hide them, but because I was afraid," she admitted. Clarissa revealed that in her last meeting with Margaret, she had sensed Margaret's desperation. Margaret had confided in her about the pressure she was under, not just from business rivals, but also from personal threats. She felt like everyone was closing in on her, Clarissa said. "She was scared, Michael. She even mentioned hiring security, but she didn't trust anyone enough." Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. Margaret had been more aware of her impending danger than anyone realized. "Did she mention any names? Anyone she thought was after her?" Harrison pressed. Clarissa shook her head. "No, she just said they, like it was more than one person. She was convinced there was a group of people conspiring against her." This information only deepened the mystery. Harrison knew that Margaret had many enemies, but a coordinated group made the threat far more serious. It also meant that those involved had resources and influence, making them even more dangerous to confront. He needed to figure out who these people were and how they were connected. Harrison decided to return to the company's financial records. He knew that whoever was threatening Margaret must have left a trail, financial dealings, covert meetings, something that would tie them together. He pored over the records for hours until he found a series of suspicious transactions involving offshore accounts, all linked to a shell corporation called Blackwood Investments. Blackwood Investments was known to be a front for laundering money and shady dealings, often used by individuals who wanted to hide their involvement in illegal activities. Harrison realized that this could be the missing link. He began tracing the ownership of the Shell Corporation and discovered that Richard Carter had ties to it. Armed with this new information, Harrison confronted Richard again. This time, Richard was less composed. Detective, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. This is bigger than you think. Margaret, she was in over her head. She didn't know when to stop. Harrison could see the fear in Richard's eyes. Who else is involved, Richard? Who are you working with? He demanded. Richard shook his head. If I tell you, they'll come for me too. He whispered, this isn't just about money, it's about power. Margaret was standing in the way of something much bigger. Richard's words confirmed Harrison's worst fears. Margaret's death was part of a larger conspiracy, one involving powerful people who were willing to do anything to achieve their goals. Harrison knew he had to tread carefully. The deeper he went, the more dangerous this case became, not just for him, but for anyone who dared to uncover the truth. Harrison decided to reach out to Thomas Wilkins again. Thomas had been involved in the financial side of things, and Harrison hoped he might be able to provide more insight now that Richard was starting to crack. Thomas was visibly more anxious this time, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of water. Detective, you have no idea how dangerous these people are, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was just trying to make a living. Richard dragged me into this, and once I realized what was going on, it was too late to back out. Harrison leaned forward. Who are they, Thomas? Who is behind Blackwood Investments? Thomas hesitated before finally speaking. There are people on the board. People with influence, not just in the company, but outside of it too. Politicians, businessmen, people who want control over everything. Margaret was a problem for them because she wouldn't let go of her shares. She was stubborn, and they needed her out of the way. Harrison realized that this conspiracy went far beyond simple corporate greed. It involved people in power, people who could manipulate the system to their advantage. Margaret had been fighting against forces much stronger than she had ever imagined. She had been alone in her struggle, with no one to trust and nowhere to turn. With this new information, Harrison approached his superior once more. He explained everything he had uncovered, the Shell Corporation, the involvement of board members, and the threats Margaret had faced. His superior listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. Michael, if what you're saying is true, this case is bigger than just a homicide. This is organized crime, he said. Harrison nodded. We need to protect Clarissa and Thomas. They're both in danger now that we know the truth, and we need to bring in Richard before he decides to disappear. His superior agreed, and measures were taken to provide protection for the witnesses, while Harrison prepared to bring Richard in for questioning. When Harrison arrived at Richard's office with a warrant, Richard was already packing his belongings. Going somewhere? Harrison asked, his voice filled with irony. Richard looked up, his face pale. You don't understand, Detective. They'll kill me. They don't leave loose ends, he said, his voice breaking. Harrison felt a moment of pity for Richard. For all his arrogance, he was now just another pawn who had lost control of the game. If you cooperate, we can protect you, but you need to tell me everything you know, Harrison said firmly. Richard hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll tell you what I know, but you need to understand this won't end well for any of us. Richard began to talk, revealing the names of those involved, board members, influential businessmen, even a senator who had stakes in Blackwood Investments. Harrison took detailed notes, knowing that this information was vital to dismantling the entire network. The conspiracy was deeper than he had imagined, and it was clear that Margaret had been caught in the middle of a battle for power. Harrison knew that this case would not end with a simple arrest. It would require a coordinated effort to bring down everyone involved. He contacted federal authorities, sharing everything he had learned. The stakes were too high, and the resources required to take down such a powerful network were beyond what his department could handle alone. The investigation continued for weeks, with Harrison working tirelessly alongside federal agents. They raided offices, froze assets, and arrested those who had conspired against Margaret. It was a massive operation, and by the end of it, many of those involved were behind bars. But Harrison knew that this was just the beginning. The true masterminds were still out there, and the fight for justice was far from over. Harrison stepped closer to Richard's desk, not taking his eyes off the suspect. You knew that sooner or later I'd come here, said the detective. You knew you'd be found. Richard merely scoffed, his face remaining impassive. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. Are you so sure you know everything, Mr. Harrison? He asked, his voice cold and hard. But do you really know what Margaret wanted? These words made Harrison pause. Richard didn't look like a man who feared punishment. Rather, he looked like someone ready to face all the consequences. Harrison began to suspect that there were still uncovered layers to this story, and that even Richard's arrest couldn't fully close the case. While Richard was being arrested and taken to the station, Harrison returned to Margaret's house to try and understand what really lay behind all these events. It seemed to him that the answer had to be somewhere here, among her belongings, books, letters, and everything left of the woman's life. He examined the house again, and this time his attention was drawn to a small painting hanging on the library wall. The painting was peculiar, and its frame seemed heavier than it should be for such a small canvas. Harrison took the painting off the wall and discovered a hidden compartment behind it. Inside were old notes and journals, carefully hidden by Margaret. Opening one of the journals, the detective realized that he had finally found something that could shed light on her true intentions. Margaret's journal was filled with memories, fears, and even descriptions of the threats she had faced. In one of the entries, Margaret wrote about her decision to sign the documents, transferring her shares because she no longer saw the point in fighting. She wrote that she felt trapped, surrounded by enemies, and that no one around her was truly loyal, not even those she considered friends. This explained why she agreed to the deal with Blackwood Investments. She could no longer cope with the pressure. Harrison realized that Margaret had felt her life was in danger. She was trying to find a way to save herself, perhaps even to escape everything. She wrote about her meetings with Clarissa, about how they talked about Henry, and how difficult it was to live in constant fear. But in one of her last entries, Margaret mentioned that she wanted to leave something behind, something that would reveal the truth about her life and struggle. The journals also contained the names of people who could pose a threat to her. Among them were Richard, Thomas, and even Evelyn. Margaret wrote that she did not trust Evelyn despite their long friendship. She suspected that her friend was playing a double game and might have been passing information to her enemies. Harrison felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. Back at the station, Harrison brought the journals as crucial evidence. They were the final nail in the coffin for Richard, Thomas, and everyone else involved in the conspiracy. When Harrison saw Richard again, he no longer looked so confident. He sat behind bars, his eyes full of malice. "You won, detective," Richard said, gritting his teeth, "but you have no idea how deep this pit goes." The trial of Richard and his accomplices was a high-profile case that attracted the attention not only of the town's residents, but of the entire country. Many were surprised that someone as powerful as Margaret could become the victim of such intrigue and betrayal. During the trial, it became clear that greed and the desire for power could push people to commit the most terrible acts. Richard was sentenced to life in prison, and Thomas received his own sentence for his role in forging documents. But even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's story didn't end with the arrest of her enemies. One evening, sitting in his office, he opened Margaret's last journal and began reading it from beginning to end, trying to understand what exactly she wanted to tell the world. In one of the entries, Margaret spoke of a love she could never experience again after Henry's death. She wrote about how everyone around her only wanted one thing: her money, her influence, her connections. She felt lonely despite all the luxury and wealth that surrounded her. She wrote about how she dreamed of simply going somewhere where no one knew her name, where she could start fresh. Harrison closed the journal, feeling the weight of the story. This was the story of a woman who wanted to be happy, but became a victim of her own wealth and misplaced trust. He understood that the truth had been uncovered, but justice did not always bring satisfaction. Margaret's story was a reminder that even the most powerful people could be vulnerable, and that behind a glittering facade could lie a lot of pain and fear. Margaret's mansion remained empty. No one wanted to live in a house that had become a place of death and secrets. From time to time, people would come to the gates to look at the house, as if it had become a symbol of something lost. The garden, once full of flowers, was now overgrown with weeds, and the windows that once reflected sunlight were now dull and covered in dust. James, the faithful servant who had served Margaret for so many years, could not stay either. He left the city, going somewhere unknown. For him, the house was full of memories, and every corner reminded him that he had become part of a tragedy he could not prevent. He felt guilt and knew that he would never find peace in that place. Evelyn also disappeared from sight. Many suspected that she knew more than she let on, but no one could prove her involvement in the conspiracy. She simply vanished without a trace. Perhaps she left to start over, or perhaps she hid to avoid facing the ghosts of the past. Harrison knew that he might never learn the truth about Evelyn's role in Margaret's life. One day, several months after the trial ended, Harrison received a letter. It contained only a few lines. "Thank you for trying to find the truth. Margaret did not deserve what happened to her, but sometimes the truth lies deeper than it seems." The signature was illegible, but the detective understood that it was from someone who knew more about Margaret than he did. This letter became the final touch to the story for him. He knew he had done everything he could to uncover the truth about Margaret's death, but perhaps there were parts of her life that would remain a mystery forever. The world is not black and white, and in every person's life there are shadows and demons. Margaret's story was proof of that, and that was it. Margaret Delacroix's mansion remained empty, and her name became a legend told in the town for many years. Some spoke of her strength and her struggle, while others spoke of her weaknesses and mistakes. But one thing was clear: her life and death became a reminder that everyone has a price, and that sometimes behind wealth and power lie deep wounds and difficult decisions. Harrison continued his work, but Margaret's story stayed with him forever. He often thought about her struggle, and the fact that no one is immune to betrayal and loneliness. But he knew one thing: he did everything he could to find the truth, and that was what mattered most to him. Margaret Delacroix's story ended, but her secrets continued to live in her journals, in the empty mansion, and in the hearts of those who knew her. And perhaps one day, someone would once again open those pages and try to understand what really happened behind the closed doors of her luxurious life.